got battleships out there, Captain. 4 of them." The words came up the voice tube from the radar shack a little after 7 in the morning, and the man they were spoken to did not answer them right away. He was standing on the bridge of a destroyer named for a sailor most of his crew had never heard of, off the coast of an island most of them could not have found on a map 3 months before, and he was looking east into a wall of rain squalls and gun smoke where, a moment earlier, there had been nothing but the gray Pacific dawn. Now there were pagoda masts. That is the thing the survivors always came back to when they told it later. Not the noise, not the fear. The masts. The Imperial Japanese Navy built the fighting tops of its battleships in stacked tiers, like the roofs of a temple, and when those silhouettes came up over the horizon off Samar on the morning of October 25th, 1944, every American sailor who saw them understood, in the space of a single breath, exactly what he was looking at. Those were not the low, flat shapes of escort carriers or destroyers. Those were the masts of capital ships. Those were the biggest guns in the world, and they were pointed at him. Commander Ernest Edwin Evans was 36 years old, was a stocky, dark-haired man with a broad face and a broader voice, and he had been the captain of the USS Johnston for exactly a year, since the day she was commissioned. He was part Cherokee and part Creek, born in a small town in Oklahoma, and the men called him Chief, some of them to his face, most of them behind his back, all of them with a peculiar mix of terror and love that destroyer crews reserve for a captain they have decided is either going to get them all killed or make them all immortal. That morning, off Samar, he was about to do both. The Johnston was a Fletcher-class destroyer. She displaced about 2,000 tons. She carried 5 5-inch guns and 10 torpedo tubes and a crew of roughly 327 young men, most of them under 25. Coming toward her, through the smoke, was a Japanese fleet of some 23 warships, including 4 battleships, and one of those battleships was the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built by any navy in the history of the world, 68,000 tons, her main guns firing shells, 18 inches across, each one heavier than a Volkswagen. The math of it was not complicated. A single hit from one of those shells would erase the Johnston and everyone on her. Behind Evans to the west were the ships he had been assigned to protect. 6 escort carriers. Jeep carriers, the men called them, converted merchant hulls, thin-skinned, slow, built to ferry aircraft, not to fight a surface battle. On those decks were pilots and mechanics and cooks. Behind the carriers on the beaches of Leyte were 130,000 American soldiers who had come ashore only days before, under General MacArthur, and who did not yet know that the fleet meant to guard them had been drawn away north during the night, chasing a decoy, leaving the back door wide open. Evans understood all of this in the time it took the radar officer to finish his sentence. He did not call for orders. There was no time to wait for orders. He turned to the helmsman, and the men on the bridge would remember that his voice was not raised, was almost conversational, the way a man's voice goes when he has already made a decision that the rest of him has not caught up to yet. "Left full rudder," he said. "All ahead flank. We're going to make a torpedo run." The helmsman looked at him. On the sea, all ahead flank means everything the engines have. Left full rudder would swing the Johnston's bow away from the carrier she was guarding and directly toward the oncoming battleships. "Sir," the helmsman said. "Toward them?" "Toward them," Evans said, and the smallest ship in the fight turned, alone, and ran straight at the biggest fleet the enemy had left in the Pacific. The first thing he did was make smoke. Johnston's stacks poured out a rolling black and white curtain, laying it between the Japanese guns and the fragile carriers behind her, blinding the enemy's rangefinders. She was the first ship in the whole American force to lay smoke, and the first to open fire, and for a few impossible minutes she was the only ship charging. One destroyer, alone, against a horizon full of battleships. On the Japanese flagship, gunnery officers peered through the smoke at the small, fast, aggressive shape driving straight at them, throwing up a wake like a speedboat, her 5 little guns already firing, and they made the calculation that would decide the battle. No one attacks a battleship fleet with a single destroyer. This had to be the screen of something much larger. This had to be the vanguard of the American fleet carriers. They were wrong. There was no fleet behind Evans. There was only Evans. But the lie his courage told the enemy that morning was about to save 10,000 men. To understand how a dentist's office-sized warship came to be charging the Yamato, and how the man on her bridge came to be the kind of man who would order it, you have to leave the smoke of Samar for a moment and go back 20 years and 6,000 miles to a dusty town in Oklahoma, and a boy who was told in 100 small ways that the sea was not meant for someone like him. Pawnee, Oklahoma, is a long way from any ocean. It sits in the north-central part of the state, in country that was Indian territory before it was a state at all, red dirt and blackjack oak, and a sky that goes on without interruption to the edge of the world. Ernest Edwin Evans was born there on the 13th of August, 1908, 3 months after Oklahoma's first full year of statehood, into a family of Cherokee and Creek blood, in a country that had spent the previous century taking land from families exactly like his. He grew up mostly in Muskogee, a railroad and river town in the old Creek Nation. His people were what the government forms of the day called, with their usual flat cruelty, non-citizen Indians for much of living memory. Men and women who had watched their nation's land broken up, allotted, and sold out from under them. Boy of Evans's background in that time and place learned early where the walls were. He learned which doors he could walk through and which he could not. He learned that the wide American promise printed in his school books came with an unprinted footnote, and that the footnote had his family's name on it. He also learned somewhere in those years about the sea. We do not know exactly how. Muskogee had a river, the Arkansas, wide and brown and slow, and maybe that was the start of it. A boy on a muddy bank watching flatboats and imagining something bigger. Maybe it was a book. Maybe it was the recruiting posters that hung in every post office in America in the years after the First World War. The ones with the clean gray ships and the clean white uniforms and the single word, opportunity, that the Navy did not entirely mean for boys like him. However it came, it took hold, and it did not let go. In 1926, at 17, he finished high school in Muscogee, and he enlisted in the United States Navy. He went in at the bottom as an ordinary enlisted sailor, which was very nearly the only way in the Navy would have him. And here the story does the thing that will define the rest of his life. He was not content to stay where they put him. After a year in the enlisted ranks, swabbing decks, standing watches, doing the invisible labor the Navy runs on, he took the examination for the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis, and he passed it. And on the 29th of June, 1927, a part-Cherokee, part-Creek boy from Indian territory walked through the gates of the most tradition-bound officer school in America as a midshipman. It is hard now to feel the full weight of that. Annapolis in 1927 was a school for the sons of admirals and senators, for old Navy families and old money, a place with its own century of customs, most of them designed to keep out exactly the kind of young man Evans was. He would have arrived with an accent that marked him, a face that marked him, a background that marked him, into a corps of midshipmen who had been raised to believe the quarterdeck was theirs by right. What he had against all of that was the thing that could not be argued with. He could do the work. He could do the mathematics of navigation and the physics of gunnery and the brutal physical grind of plebe year, and he could do it while being watched more closely and forgiven less easily than any of the boys around him. He graduated in 1931 and was commissioned an ensign in the United States Navy. Think about what that meant. In a country that in most of its states still would not let his relatives vote without a fight, that had made its native people citizens by law only in 1924, 7 years before. In that country, Ernest Evans now held the commission of an officer, entitled to command white sailors, entitled to walk a quarterdeck as the equal of any Annapolis blue blood. He had not been given it. There were no gifts on offer for a boy like him. He had taken it, one examination and one watch at a time. The men who knew him in those years describe an officer who was blunt, physical, quick to anger and quicker to forgive, utterly without pretension, and possessed of a plain, stubborn courage that had nothing theatrical in it. He did not talk about where he came from. He did not have to. Every ribbon he earned, every rung he climbed, was an argument he was making without words to a Navy that had bet against him. And then, in the last months of 1941, the argument stopped being about him, because a fleet he had sworn to serve was about to be caught at anchor on a Sunday morning in Hawaii, And Ernest Evans, by then a lieutenant commander in the far waters of the Dutch East Indies, was about to spend a year and a half learning, in the worst possible way, exactly what it feels like to be on the losing side of the sea. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Ernest Evans was on the other side of the world, in the East Indies, aboard an old, tired destroyer called the USS Alden. The Alden was a relic, a four-piper, a narrow flush-deck destroyer built at the end of the First World War, worn thin by 2 decades of service, part of the small and hopelessly outmatched Asiatic fleet. In March of 1942, Evans became her commanding officer. It was his first command. It came in the middle of the worst stretch of the entire war for the United States Navy, because in those first months, the Navy lost. It lost everywhere, and it lost badly. Evans and the Alden were part of the doomed Allied effort to hold the Dutch East Indies against the Japanese advance, a running series of night actions and retreats through the Java Sea and the Straits south of it, in which an outgunned, outnumbered, and out-coordinated fleet of American, British, and Australian ships was ground down and swept aside. Cruisers he had sailed alongside went to the bottom. The waters filled with oil and men, and the Alden and Evans did what the whole fleet was doing in those months. They fought where they could, and then they ran south and south again, because there was nothing else to be done. This is the part of the story that the legend usually leaves out, and it is the part that made everything else possible. Ernest Evans spent the opening chapter of the Pacific War in retreat. He spent it watching a proud Navy get beaten, watching ships die that should not have died, watching men go into the water and not come out, and, worst of all for a man built the way he was built, watching commanders make the coldly correct decision again and again to withdraw and save the ship rather than turn and fight. He was a good enough officer to know that those decisions were right. He was the kind of man for whom being right about a retreat is its own particular kind of wound. Survivors and biographers who traced his life afterward believed that something hardened in him in those Java Sea months. A private promise, never written down, that if the Navy ever gave him a real ship, a fast ship, a ship with teeth, he would never spend her in retreat. He had learned what it cost to run. He had decided what he would do instead. In October of 1943, the Navy gave him the ship. Her name was Johnston, hull number DD-5557, a brand new Fletcher-class destroyer built in Seattle. 2,100 tons of the best destroyer design the war produced, 5 5-inch guns and armored mounts, 10 torpedo tubes, geared turbines that could drive her past 35 knots, a crew of eager, half-trained kids from every corner of the country. She was everything the poor old Alden had not been. She was fast, and she was armed, and she was his. At her commissioning ceremony on the 27th of October, 1943, Commander Evans stood before his new crew and the assembled guests and said the sentence they would all remember for the rest of their lives. The sentence that would be quoted at memorials for the next 80 years. "This is going to be a fighting ship," he told them. "I intend to go in harm's way. And anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." He was quoting, whether the young sailors knew it or not, John Paul Jones, the father of the American Navy, who had written that he wished to have no connection with any ship that did not sail in harm's way. It was the oldest promise in the service. Coming out of the mouth of an Oklahoma boy who had spent 18 months in retreat, it was not a slogan. It was a vow. Nobody got off. The next year, Evans made good on the first half of the promise the easy way, the way every destroyer captain did in the grinding, unglamorous work of the Central Pacific. The Johnston screened carriers and bombarded beaches through the invasions of the Marshall Islands and the Marianas. At Guam, Evans drove her in so close to shore to support the Marines that she took fire from Japanese soldiers with rifles. And when his ship ran low on ammunition, he climbed into a small boat and motored across to the flagship to demand more in person. His crew learned that their captain's appetite for the fight was not an act. They learned that in harm's way was a place he genuinely intended to take them. What none of them knew, what no one could have known, was that the whole first year was only rehearsal. That the real bill for the vow would come due on a single morning in October of 1944, off an island called Samar, when the sea would offer Ernest Evans the exact thing he had promised at the commissioning: a chance to go in harm's way against the longest odds any American destroyer would face in the entire war, and he would not hesitate for even a second. To understand how the Johnston ended up alone in front of the Japanese battle fleet, you have to understand a trick, one of the most successful and most costly tricks of the entire Pacific War. In October of 1944, the United States had come to take back the Philippines. The landings went in at Leyte on the 20th. 130,000 men of the 6th Army waited ashore, and General MacArthur, true to his promise, waded in behind them. The Japanese response was a desperate, complicated plan to throw the entire remaining strength of the Imperial Navy at the invasion fleet from 3 directions at once and smash the landings before they could take hold. The most powerful of the 3 Japanese forces was the Center Force, under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, a fist of battleships and heavy cruisers built around the 2 greatest battleships ever constructed, the Yamato and her sister Musashi. Its job was to punch through the islands, come around into Leyte Gulf, and annihilate the thin-skinned transports and the soldiers still crowding the beaches. On October 24th, American carrier planes caught this force in the Sibuyan Sea and hammered it for a full day. They sank the mighty Musashi. They watched Kurita turn west, apparently retreating, apparently beaten. And Admiral William Halsey, commanding the powerful Third Fleet, the fast battleships and fleet carriers that were the real shield of the invasion, made a fateful decision. To the north, the Japanese had dangled a bait, a force of aircraft carriers, nearly empty of planes, sacrificial, meant to lure the American heavyweights away. Halsey took the bait. He turned his entire Third Fleet north during the night of the 24th, chasing the decoy carriers, certain that Kurita's battered center force was finished. Kurita was not finished. In the dark, he turned back east, threaded the San Bernardino Strait, and came out the back door into the Philippine Sea. And there was nothing between his battleships and the invasion beaches except a thin picket line of little ships that had been left behind to do humble work. That picket line was Taffy 3. Taffy 3, formerly Task Unit 77.4.3, was commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, a man his friends called Ziggy. It was not a battle fleet. It was 6 escort carriers, slow and unarmored, their decks crowded with aircraft meant to support the troops ashore and hunt submarines. And their thin screen, 3 destroyers, of which the Johnston was one, and 4 smaller destroyer escorts. Between them, they mounted nothing heavier than a 5-inch gun. They were the naval equivalent of a mail delivery convoy. They were never ever meant to fight a fleet. At about 6:45 on the morning of October 24th, lookouts on the Taffy 3 carriers reported anti-aircraft fire to the north. Anti-aircraft fire made no sense. There were no enemy planes. Then the pagoda masts came over the horizon, and the first colored geysers of battleship-caliber shells. The Japanese dyed their shell splashes different colors so each ship could spot its own fall of shot, began to rise around the American carriers in pink and green and yellow and red. Sprague on his flagship understood in an instant that his little force was about to be massacred, and that behind him lay the beachhead and the transports and the 130,000 men. He did the only 2 things he could do. He turned his carriers toward the nearest rain squall and radioed for every ounce of help in the Pacific. And he ordered his screen, the destroyers, the small boys, in the Navy's affectionate slang, to counterattack, to charge the Japanese line and buy time with their hulls. The Johnston, Commander Evans did not wait to be ordered. The survivors are unanimous on this point, and it is one of the reasons the story has never faded. Before the flagship's signal to attack had even been fully received and understood, before the order to charge had rippled down through the force, the Johnston was already heeling hard over, already trailing smoke, already accelerating, already turning, alone, toward the enemy. Her captain had seen the mass, done the arithmetic, and decided. Every other ship in Taffy 3 would fight bravely that morning. Only one had a captain who charged before he was told to. The man from Pawnee had waited his whole life to be underestimated for the last time. And on the bridge of the Yamato, the officers of the most powerful surface fleet left to the Empire of Japan looked at the single mad destroyer sprinting at them out of its own smoke, and they began, fatally, to assume it could not possibly be alone. The range when the Johnston opened fire was about 10 miles, and closing fast, because she was closing it herself, driving in at better than 30 knots to get inside torpedo range of ships that could have destroyed her from 3 times the distance. Gunnery officer was a young lieutenant named Robert Hagen, and it was Hagen who left the description that has outlived nearly everyone who was there. The Johnston's 5.5-inch guns were, against a battleship, almost a joke, like throwing rocks at a tank. But Hagen and his gun crews served them with a speed that bordered on the supernatural, and in the first minutes of the run, they threw more than 200 shells at the oncoming giants, walking their fire across the superstructure of the nearest heavy cruiser, starting fires, blinding, rangefinders, doing the one thing a destroyer's guns could do, making a nuisance of themselves that could not be ignored. Then Evans got what he had come for. At about 7,000 yards, knife-fighting range for a warship, he swung the Johnston broadside and fired all 10 of her torpedoes in a single spread. The whole of her killing power launched in one throw, and then heeled hard away behind a fresh wall of smoke. The torpedoes ran hot and straight toward the heavy cruiser Kumano, and one of them found her. The explosion blew the bow off the cruiser. It was a stunning blow. A 2,000-ton destroyer had just crippled a heavy cruiser many times her size, knocked her clean out of the battle, and forced a second cruiser to drop out and escort her. For a heartbeat aboard the Johnston, there was something like exultation. Hagen would remember the cheering. They had charged the fleet, and they had drawn blood, and they were still afloat. The heartbeat did not last, because the battleships had found the range. The first salvo that hit the Johnston came, most likely, from the 14-inch guns of a battleship. 3 shells, each the weight of a small car, striking a ship built of quarter-inch plate. Then came the 6-inch shells from a light cruiser, a fast, rippling series of them walking up the deck. Hagen, groping for words afterward, said it was like a puppy being smacked by a truck. The bridge was wrecked. The after part of the ship was torn open. Men who had been standing at their stations a moment before were simply gone. Johnston lurched, lost speed, and for a few seconds seemed to stagger under the sheer weight of what had hit her. And Ernest Evans was down. The blast that raked the bridge had caught him. It tore 2 fingers off his left hand, shredded his shirt, and drove shrapnel into his neck and chest, and left him standing in the smoke, stripped to the waist, bleeding, his hand wrapped in a rag. Men who saw him in that moment expected him to go below, to hand off the ship to let the wounds win. He wrapped the hand and stayed on his feet. When the damage to the bridge and the steering made it impossible to con the ship from where a captain is supposed to stand, Evans climbed down and aft, to the stern, to the emergency steering station, a cramped, half-open position over the rudder engine. And from there, for the rest of the battle, he fought his ship in the most primitive way imaginable, shouting his rudder orders down an open hatch to the sailors in the compartment below, who hauled the great rudder over by hand, by muscle, because the power that normally turned it was gone. Picture that, because it is the true center of the whole story. Not the charge, not the torpedoes. This, a part-Cherokee kid from Oklahoma who had climbed all the way from a swab's bucket to the Naval Academy to the bridge of his own warship, now stripped to the waist and bleeding from a mangled hand, standing over an open hatch at the very back of a burning, sinking destroyer, roaring right full rudder and left full rudder into a hole in the deck, steering by voice and by will, keeping the smallest ship in the battle turned toward the biggest fleet in the ocean. He was not trying to escape. Not once in the 2.5 hours that followed did Ernest Evans try to escape. The carriers he was guarding were crawling away to the southwest at their pitiful top speed, hiding in rain and smoke, and every minute Evans could keep the Japanese occupied with the Johnston was a minute those carriers, and the 10,000 men on them, stayed alive. That was the whole of his job now. Not to win. He could not win. To buy time with a dying ship and a broken body, and to make the enemy pay for every minute in confusion and blood. He had told them, a year before, that this was going to be a fighting ship. He had told them he intended to go in harm's way. Now he stood in the very heart of it, and he made the promise true with everything he had left. What the Johnston did for the next 2.5 hours does not read like the record of one ship. It reads like the record of a squadron. Battered, slowed, her torpedoes gone, one engine room flooded, she should have been finished. Instead, Evans threw her back into the fight again and again. When the American destroyer escorts, the even smaller small boys, were ordered in to make their own desperate torpedo runs, the Johnston, half-wrecked as she was, turned and ran interference for them, putting herself between them and the enemy guns, drawing fire onto her own tortured hull so little ships behind her might live long enough to launch. With no torpedoes left, Evans took her back in against a battleship and fired some 30 rounds of 5-inch into its towering side. Pinpricks. And he knew they were pinpricks, but pinpricks that kept the giant's attention fixed on him and away from the fleeing carriers. Then the Japanese sent in their own destroyers and a light cruiser to make a torpedo attack on the American carriers. The killing blow, if it landed. And there in the way was the Johnston. Evans took his sinking ship straight into the path of the enemy's destroyer squadron. Hagen's guns, still firing, fixed on the lead ships. The Johnston, a wreck fighting from a stern-mounted steering station, so disordered the Japanese torpedo run that the enemy launched early and wild, and their torpedoes ran out and detonated harmlessly, and the blow that might have gutted Taffy 3 came to nothing. One ruined destroyer had broken up the attack of a squadron, but there is only so long that arithmetic can be defied. The Johnston was now the focus of the fury of ships on every side of her. Japanese cruisers and destroyers closed in and simply pounded her, at ranges so short they could not miss, until she was less a ship than a burning raft that still, impossibly, fired back. Her guns went one by one. Her speed fell away to nothing. Her decks, in the words of one survivor, became a pile of people, the living and the dead together in the smoke. The sea around her boiled with shell splashes. And still, from the stern, the orders came, hoarse now, the captain's voice gone rough with smoke and blood, and the sheer labor of 2.5 hours of command in the middle of an inferno. At about 9:45 in the morning, dead in the water, ringed by enemy ships firing into her at point-blank range, Ernest Evans finally gave the order he had spent his whole life refusing to give. He told his men to abandon ship. He gave it, the survivors said, without panic, moving among them, telling the living to get over the side, get clear, get away from the ship before she went down and dragged them with her. He had run out of ways to keep her fighting. He had not run out of ways to keep them alive. The order to abandon ship was, for a captain like Evans, not surrender. It was the last command of a man still, to his final minute, trying to save the boys in his care. At about 10:10, the USS Johnston rolled over onto her side and began to slide beneath the Pacific, bow first. And then the thing happened that no one who saw it ever forgot. A Japanese destroyer, one of the ships that had been firing into her, came in close, 1,000 yards, no more, as the Johnston went down. The American survivors already in the water, clinging to rafts and floating wreckage, and one another, saw her coming and braced for the worst, because a warship closing on helpless men in the water usually meant machine guns. It had happened before in this ocean to men like them. Machine guns did not come. Instead, on the bridge wing of the Japanese destroyer, the survivors saw a figure, an officer in a clean uniform, one man among the ranks of sailors lining the enemy rail. And as the shattered little American destroyer that had charged their entire fleet slipped under, that officer came to attention, and he raised his hand and he saluted her. The enemy saluted the Johnston as she died. It is the single most famous moment of the Battle off Samar, and it endures because of what it means. The Imperial Japanese Navy was not in the habit of honoring the ships it sank. That salute was not courtesy, it was recognition. The involuntary respect of professional warriors who had just watched a 2,000-ton destroyer, alone, do something they would not have believed possible if they had not stood there and been on the receiving end of it. They had come expecting to brush aside a screen of insignificant ships. They had instead been fought to a standstill by them. And a man on the winning side, looking at the little ship going down, understood that he had underestimated her and her captain and every man aboard. And he did the only thing a warrior can do with that knowledge. He saluted. Somewhere in the oil and the wreckage, Commander Ernest Evans was still alive. Survivors reported seeing him in the water, alive after the ship went down. He was never seen again. The salute did not save the men in the water. Nothing did for a long time. The survivors of the Johnston and of her sisters Hole and Samuel B. Roberts, sunk in the same fight, were left floating in the open Pacific as the battle moved away from them and the day wore on and no one came. There had been chaos in the American command. The frantic messages, the confusion over where the fleet actually was, the sheer disbelief that Taffy 3 had survived at all meant that the rescue ships were slow to be sent. So the men waited in kapok life jackets and on scattered rafts, through the afternoon, through the night, through the next day, and through the next night. Roughly 50 hours. 50 hours in salt water does terrible things to a body and worse things to a mind. Men died of their wounds, and died of exhaustion, slipping under between one breath and the next. And men died because they were not alone in that water. The sharks came, drawn by the blood, and took the living and the dead. And the survivors could do nothing but bunch together and kick and shout and watch their friends be taken. When the rescue ships finally arrived, they pulled from the sea a fraction of the men who had gone into it. Of the Johnston's crew of roughly 327, 186 were dead. Only about 141 came home. Commander Evans was not among them. He had gone into the water alive, and he had not survived it. And his body, like the bodies of so many of his men, was given to the Pacific and never recovered. The Oklahoma boy who had crossed a continent and a color line and an ocean to command his own ship has no grave on land. What he was given instead was the thing his whole life had been an argument for. In 1945, the United States awarded Commander Ernest Edwin Evans the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest decoration for valor, for his conduct off Samar. The citation describes the charge: the torpedo attack pressed home under straddling fire, the refusal to yield a ship that was being torn apart beneath him. He was the first Native American in the history of the United States Navy to receive it. The medal was presented to his widow. The country that had, for most of his boyhood, not been entirely sure it considered his people citizens, now held him up as the highest example of what an American sailor could be. And the battle he had died to effect, it turned out he had effected it more than he could ever have known. Vice Admiral Kurita, on the bridge of the Yamato, had watched the destroyers and the little escorts and the aircraft from the American carriers hurl themselves at his fleet with a ferocity that made no sense unless he was facing something far larger than a handful of jeep carriers. Torpedoes forced his great ships to turn and comb their wakes, scattering his formation. The smoke and the rain hid the American strength, or the American weakness, from him. Convinced he had blundered into the main American fleet carriers, worried about the air attacks and his own mounting damage and the dwindling day, Kurita made his decision. With the beachhead almost within his reach, with nothing left that could truly stop him, he broke off the action, turned north, and ultimately withdrew back through the strait he had come from. The transports were not touched. The 130,000 men on Leyte were not driven into the sea. The most dangerous surface threat the Japanese Navy could still mount in 1944 turned around and went home. In no small part because a scattering of small boys, led by a destroyer that charged before she was told to, convinced an admiral that they were something they were not. Ernest Evans had spent his life being underestimated. In the last 2.5 hours of it, he turned the enemy's underestimation into a weapon and used it to save 10,000 men. For 75 years, the exact resting place of his ship was unknown. A set of coordinates in the deep, a name on a memorial wall for the missing. Then in 2019, a deep-sea expedition found a wreck on the floor of the Philippine Trench, and in March of 2021 it was confirmed. The USS Johnston, lying upright and broken more than 20,000 feet down, nearly 4 miles beneath the surface. The deepest shipwreck ever located and surveyed by human beings. Cameras sent down into that eternal darkness found her hull number still legible on the bow: 557. She had gone deeper than almost any human artifact on Earth, and she was still, after everything, recognizably herself. In 2024, the Navy announced that a new destroyer, a warship for a new century, would carry into the world's oceans the name USS Ernest E. Evans. So the boy from Pawnee will go to sea again. There's a kind of justice that arrives too late to be of any use to the man who earned it, and it is the only kind this story has to offer. Ernest Evans did not live to hear the citation read. He did not see the enemy fleet turn away. He did not know that the salute the Japanese officer gave his sinking ship would be told and retold until it became one of the sacred moments of the American Navy. He did not know that men would find his ship 4 miles down and read her number in the dark, or that a warship would one day bear his name. He knew only what he knew on that bridge at 7 in the morning when the pagoda mast came over the horizon and the voice tube told him there were battleships out there, 4 of them, and everything in the rules and the odds and the long, Hard arithmetic of his life told him to run. He turned toward them instead. He had promised he would. A fighting ship in harm's way. Anyone who didn't want to go along could get off. Nobody got off. And the sea, which had taken so much from his people and given them so little, took him too in the end. But not before he had stood at the very back of a burning ship with 2 fingers gone and his shirt blown off his back, steering by his own voice into the largest guns in the world and made an enemy that outnumbered him 100 to 1 stop and stand and salute.